Well, greetings everyone from the intergalactic headquarters of Trout Unlimited here in Arlington, Virginia. As Jeff suggested, I'm disappointed that we can't all be together today, but very much looking forward to St. Paul next year. It promises to be a bigger and better event than ever, so please make your plans now. I have to tell you that this is one of the highlights of the year for me to be able to celebrate all of your accomplishments over the past year, and specifically to celebrate some of the great champions of our favorite rivers. Because when you get down to it, this is who we are. We are the champions for all of the places that we live, love, and fish. This is a familiar schematic for many of you. You know, this describes our landscape approach to conservation, where we know it's not enough to simply draw a line around a wilderness area and call it a day. We have to ensure that fish can move through connected systems in response to floods and fire and drought. And this model of protecting, reconnecting, and restoring our river systems is really the best hope that we have of recovering the natural resilience of our rivers and streams so they're better able to withstand the effects of a changing climate. And you can see on the left over here that we had a banner year last year, protecting more than 1 million acres of land and reconnecting well over 1,000 miles of rivers and streams. Importantly, sustaining this work so that it endures is a huge priority for us. Almost as important, if not more important, frankly, than the ecological goals that we have as an organization. And I'm really pleased to say that thanks to Beverly and her team, that this year we had over 100,000 kids participate in TU conservation work. We had over 5,000 veterans and first responders who were among those who engaged in over 5,000 community events around the nation. These numbers show all of your collective awesomeness. Pay close attention to the volunteer hours over on the left here, at least on my left. Before COVID, we were at about 700,000 hours of service to our communities. And I fully expect that we will surpass that next year and cross the Rubicon very soon of 1 million hours of service in just a few years. Truly an amazing statistic. And this shows the revenues of the organization over the past few years, past 10 years. If you add the 16 million that I showed in the previous slide, raised by volunteers, little old TU, which was about an $8 million a year organization when I started here, is now over $100 million a year of putting conservation on the ground. And we're in FY25 right now. I fully expect that the national organization this year alone will exceed $100 million. This just shows different revenue streams for the organization. You can see by this green line here that most of our growth has occurred on the public sector side. These are state and federal agency partners. It's largely, not entirely, but largely the result of funding for restoration that came through the Inflation Reduction Act and the bipartisan infrastructure law. And those monies are now flowing through Trout Unlimited and being applied on the ground. A special public service plea here. You'll notice the bottom line, the lightest blue line, are membership dues. And those have remained relatively flat over the past 10 years. And I hope we can all commit to trying to, as my friend Scott Hood says, get one for TU. If each of us went out and grabbed one of our neighbors or one of our friends to become a member, we could do more to grow our membership and increase our efficacy on the ground. These are, by now, I imagine, the familiar 3 goals of our strategic plan. You know, you've heard me make this joke before, but we're like the old Soviet Union. We do strategic plans every 5 years, hopefully to greater effect than they. And I'm going to spend the bulk of my time this evening speaking about priority waters and our engagement goals. But I would really be remiss not to call out a few champions for that 3rd goal of bringing TU's technology into the 21st century. And I specifically want to call out our IT, our HR, and our conservation teams, all of whom worked extremely hard over the past year or so to stand up not one, not two, but three different IT systems that will help employees to more effectively manage their budgets, that will help employees to more effectively pay attention to internal TU policies, but most importantly, that will better enable us to understand more about what our members and supporters care about, and then to market to them based on their own interests. I was told when we went into this that doing one implementation is always problematic. Doing two is going to be really, really difficult, but doing three IT implementations all at the same time was going to be more than a challenge. And it was. The implementation was not flawless, but all of these improvements are part of a broader effort to engage more people to donate, advocate, and volunteer on behalf of TU's mission. So this map shows the juxtaposition of our priority waters. They're the areas that are in maroon on the map. And those green dots represent projects by different agencies, which you can see in that key above the map. And these are all a function, largely a function, I should say, of those two laws that I mentioned earlier. And I want to salute as a champion Austin Williams, who has been such a strong leader for our work with all of these multiple federal agencies. Working with one federal agency is not easy. Working with 8 or 9 at the same time with all of their own, curious bureaucratic mores can be really challenging. And Austin does it with aplomb, with a lot of help from a lot of other people, I should say. Branch Rickey, who was the general manager of the Dodgers, and he integrated baseball by bringing Jackie Robinson into the league, used to say that luck is the residue of design. And the fact that we had worked with our partners, chapters, and councils to develop this national network of priority waters really put us in the catbird seat to receive restoration funding. And to date, we have had over 160 projects. Those are what you see displayed on this map here. Some of those dots represent multiple projects, representing over $160 million of work that we've been able to apply, as you can see, in 95% of the time to our priority watersheds. I know we're all too familiar, especially those of us who live in the East or the Southeast, with the devastation associated with the recent hurricanes. Helene brought devastating floods and winds to the Southeast. In Tennessee, the Overmountain chapter of Tennessee, rather than do their typical monthly fishing outing, they decided to do a cleanup in the community. And they expected about 20 people to show up. More than 200 came. And I spoke to Mark Spangler, who's the NLC rep from Tennessee, and he talked about how local churches showed up with bags of barbecue that they'd made in their for the volunteers in their basement kitchens. And I want to read you what he said to me. He said, we're just trying to help out the best we can. You go through life and there is so much negativity. These hurricanes, 2 wars are happening. People are so divided and negative. On Saturday, all the negativity disappeared for a while, and it reminded me of all the good in the world. And I want to be clear that I'm celebrating the Overmountain chapter, but they're just one of many, many TU and Five Rivers chapters who are giving back to their communities in this time of truly dire need. Hopefully, all of you have heard about the good news from the removal of the 4 Klamath River dams in the Klamath straddles Oregon and California. This is such an amazing story. In 2000, the Clinton administration, in an effort to protect an endangered sucker, which had habitat up above the dams, they basically shut the water off to the irrigators up there, causing tremendous social and economic dislocation. And there was an election, and in 2001, the Bush administration came, and they basically, even though it was a drought year, they opened the spigots for the irrigators. By the way, these irrigators had been promised federal water in order to move into this semi-arid landscape, 100 years ago. But as a result of opening up the spigots for the irrigators, there wasn't enough water in the river, and we lost 50,000 endangered salmon and steelhead that died that year. In 2005, because we lost that entire year class, the commercial fishery was shut down in California for the first time ever. And thus began a series of very complicated and complex negotiations that were led by stream champions such as Chuck Bonham, who used to be our California program director. He's now the director of California Department of Fish and Wildlife. And then Brian Johnson, his predecessor at TU, which culminated in the 4 Klamath dams being removed this summer, thereby reopening 450 miles of habitat for salmon and steelhead. Now here is an image of the first dam being breached to drain the reservoir and then a second one being dismantled. I will show you a slightly more dramatic dam removal in a few moments here, but this here, these are 2 examples, Copco number 1 on the left, Copco number 2 on the right. You can see where they're both dammed in the pictures above. And then down below, here's what they look like as free-flowing rivers. And here it is for the other 2 as well. And now remember, the Klamath was historically the 3rd largest producer of salmon in the lower 48, behind the Columbia Snake System and the Sacramento system. And now that those dams have been removed, we fully expect them to return to their former glory. Evidence of that is found in this video of the first salmon making their way past the removed dams for the first time in over a century. If that video doesn't give you chills, you should take your pulse, make sure you're still breathing, because it's incredibly dramatic. Now, of course, we have 100 years of degradation above those dams, and happily for us, we have another stream champion named Kristen Rivard. She started an organization called the Klamath Basin Rangeland Trust to try to bring together conservation interests and ranching interests in the upper basin above the dams, before ultimately merging her organization with TU about a decade ago. And today, she and her team will lead the restoration of the Upper Klamath. You can see in the image here, what they're doing is building something called beaver dam analogs to help raise the water table and expand the influence of the water table to adjacent riparian areas, which is good for a whole host of things that depend on riparian areas. And our hope is, because of the work of Kristen and her team, we're going to be able to restore some great rivers, such as the Wood, the Williamson, and the Sprague. Our volunteers in Maine are incredible stream champions for Atlantic salmon. By the end of June, I think it was only 30 Atlantic salmon had made it to the Lockwood Dam. And there they were unceremoniously put into a truck. They weren't even allowed to call shotgun. They had to sit in aerated tanks in the back as they were driven past 4 dams to the quality habitat that lay in the headwaters in the Sandy River, about 800, 900 miles upstream. And thanks to the 3,000 people, many of them TU volunteers, including a solid 90 people who showed up for a public hearing. And by the way, that's about half the people in the state of Maine. But because of those folks voicing their displeasure over this annual road trip that these magnificent fish are required to take, people are now talking seriously about the need to recover this system. And I would be remiss not to mention that the primary stream champions here are the members of the Kennebec Valley chapter and the Kennebec Coalition. And they paved the way forward, I guess it's 30, 40 years ago, with their work, well, not 25 years ago, with their work to remove the Edwards Dam back in 1999. So the Rattlesnake is a tributary to the Clark Fork in Montana. It's right upstream, several miles up of Missoula, Montana. And Rob Roberts, I'm going to start this video here. Rob Roberts helped to remove the dam closest to town in 2020. 7 more after that, dams remain upstream in a wilderness area. To take this dam out, Rob and his team had to live in wall tents for 23 consecutive days. And because these dams are in a wilderness where, forgive the pronoun here, but the language reads where man is a visitor who does not remain. Rob and his team were only allowed to take one helicopter flight in to move equipment. They could use one power auger and 2 wheelbarrows to make the former dam site a river again. I spoke to Rob about this not long ago, and he estimated that it took 2,000 wheelbarrows full of dirt and rock to turn the former reservoir back into a river. And the coolest part of this story is not the fact that we blew that dam up, which is the way to remove a dam, by gosh. The cool part is that the town of Missoula asked us if we should take all the dams out. And we actually encouraged them to keep 2 of them in for future potential water supply needs for the city of Missoula. Back in the 1980s, someone had the bright idea of damming the headwaters of the upper Colorado and then running that water through a series of tunnels to people in the Front Range. What happened next is not at all surprising. That formerly gold medal fishery went into a steep decline. Whirling disease was rampant, and the prolific bug hatches basically disappeared from this section of the river. 2 different stream champions emerged, among many, I should say. I'm highlighting people in each of these stories, but as with everything Trout Unlimited does, it's all done in partnership with others. And I'm simply trying to call out the real champions. But in this case, there were 2 of them. The first was a man named Bud Isaacs, who I became friendly with. He was a local landowner and an oil man to boot. And he teamed up with one of our awesome TU staff, Melly Whiting, who is just retired. And they rallied people around this idea of creating a natural stream channel around that reservoir. So that stream that you see on the left, you can actually see a track hoe in it in the foreground. That's a constructed stream. The reservoir is on the right. But Bud and Melly's vision to build this bypass effectively, bypassing the dam, allowing the Front Range people to get their water, and in the process creating a mile of new gold medal trout fishery. It required $33 million to build this beautiful stretch of new river. And I very much look forward to personally experiencing the benefits of that and reporting back on the fruits of our labors. The Meadowee has always been a hidden gem in Vermont. Fished this river when I was in college there. And thanks to stream champions such as Aaron Rogers of TU and Jeremy Mears of the Green Mountain National Forest up in Vermont, the Meadowee will only improve as an awesome wild trout fishery. Over the past few years, Erin and her partners have removed 6 different dams, opening up the headwaters of the Meadowee all the way down to Lake Champlain. And to be clear, this was no walk in the park. In one location, Erin had a landowner that was okay with removing the dam, but they wanted to maintain the spillway for sentimental reasons, I guess. Erin obliged. In another location, after removing one dam, they found another buried in silt 50 feet upstream from the old dam. And finally, Erin had to reckon with a bridge that was built on top of a dam. Erin took out the dam and we built a new bridge for the landowner. In fact, the bridge that you're looking at in this image is in fact the bridge that we provided for that landowner. And this just goes to show you that sometimes being a stream champion takes not only commitment, but also creativity and an unwavering sense of optimism. I have often described TU as the patron saint of forgotten or ignored environmental causes. And perhaps no issue better describes that fact than the scourge of abandoned hard rock mines. These old silver, copper, gold, and other mines have no one who can be held responsible for cleaning up their toxic legacy of leaching zinc and cadmium and arsenic into our rivers and drinking water supplies. I learned about this issue when I first came to TU from the U.S. Forest Service more than 20 years ago. And I thought, man, this is a layup. There is no constituency for acid mine drainage. There is no lobby group in Washington, D.C. for yellow rivers. We should get legislation passed to fix this problem within a year. 20 years later, thanks to the efforts of champions such as Corey Fisher, Jason Willis, who you see here, this is a front page paper in the Denver Post, a front page story in the Denver Post. Jason's one of our on the ground mining engineers. People like Paul Parsons and many others, we are as close as we have ever been to getting in front of this problem. Our Good Samaritan legislation passed the Senate this year 100-0. Let me say that again. It passed 100-0. It was through unanimous consent. No one objected to it. We had 40 original co-sponsors in the Senate. 20 were Democrats, 20 were Republicans. It passed the key House committee unanimously, and we're hoping finally to make it across the finish line in the House in the so-called lame duck session between the election and the swearing in a few weeks. So speaking of the Forest Service, when I was there and probably viewed by many in the agency as a young punk, one of the things I did was I helped to protect nearly 60 million acres of wilderness quality lands. And when I had the opportunity to come to TU, I thought, well, this isn't that hard. Where's the next big score? I was wrong. I am proud to say that over the past 22 years, TU has helped to protect more than 37 million acres of public land. We have educated, organized, and mobilized hundreds of thousands of hunters and anglers to protect incredible landscapes. But what I've learned at TU is that conservation is really a long game. And most land protection these days is really 3 yards in a cloud of dust. And that's what makes the work of stream champions such as Steve Kandel and Lindsay Slater and Sophia Kelke so important in the Oahe Canyonlands, where we have negotiated a plan with ranchers that would allow Congress to designate 1 million acres of new wilderness from the Canyonlands while ensuring that the ranching economy can continue. Bridging divides is at the heart of what TU does. So many things in our country today are posited as a zero-sum game, but it's a false choice. In fact, it's a fool's choice. We are all Americans, and we all want the same thing for our kids. The Oahe Initiative demonstrates that we can meet the needs of people while still meeting the needs of our lands and waters. And while 1 million acres isn't exactly 60 million, it's still a huge score for conservation. Now, I should have mentioned earlier that was Sophia with the big fish, the big brown trout in the previous picture. And this is her on a big bulletin board outside of Bend, Oregon. And one of the things I love about being TU is seeing its multi-generational influence. You see members make daughters and sons and grandchildren life members, and chapter presidents pass the mantle to their sons and daughters. And now we see the same at the staff level. Sophia, whose big fish made it to this billboard, is the daughter of Mark Kelke. And Mark was one of our first Alaska hires, and he took me on my first steelhead trip in Alaska 17 years ago. Today, Sophia, who I first met as a little girl, is playing a key part in protecting 1 million acres of the Oahes. I remember when I first fished in the James River Basin of Virginia, I remember smiling, and I still smile today, at some of the names of the rivers, places like the cow pasture and the bull pasture and the calf pasture, not to be outdone, the little calf pasture. I remember the morning I fished them, I realized why they had those names. Trout fed by the springs and loved the rivers, but so did the cows. And let me tell you, it is much more difficult to remove a fly from an errant cast when it's attached to a cow than it is a tree. And happily, about 10 years ago, we hired Sammy Vest to work on restoration in the headwaters of the Upper James. And I can tell you with great confidence, practically no one knew from that area who TU was at the time. Today, Sammy is trusted by the agencies and he's trusted by the local farmers. He's the linchpin in helping agencies like the local soil and water conservation districts get money into the hands of farmers to help fence off streams and recover riparian areas, as you see in this image here. Now, thanks to the fact that this area has higher elevations and it has an abundance of springs, Sammy's work and that of other volunteers from chapters in the area ensure a bright future for trout in the area despite climate change. And I'll tell you one thing that I know to be true. People in the Upper James sure know who TU is today. This is a great story. I first learned about Cub Creek. I can honestly tell you I had never heard of it before. I think it was 3 years ago. I was at the beach with my family and I received a frantic call from our then general counsel. And what she told me was, Chris, you've got to do something. Terry Turner, who, by the way, was a board member of the national organization, wants to use a helicopter to drop 250 trees into a river in Oregon. You've got to stop this. As soon as I learned that Terry wasn't actually flying the helicopter, I approved the project. You can see in this image here how Terry and his partners at the Forest Service and the state loaded up basically the floodplain area that had been historically bereft of wood. And when the next flood comes, it will create miles and miles of new spawning and rearing habitat in this important tributary of the Clackamas. When I talked to Terry about this project, he told me that the chapter's budget in the year before the initial project, this is a multi-phase project now, it was about $20,000. And today it's over $500,000 because of the great work they're doing with partners at the state and with the Forest Service. Corey Toy, Nick Walrath, and Hillary Walrath are 3 stream champions who for close to 20 years have worked with the Bureau of Land Management to make Muddy Creek an important tributary for native trout. The challenge for Muddy Creek, like so many of our streams across the United States, it's not unique to the West, is that we eliminated beavers from the landscape and then we practiced intensive agriculture, in this case, grazing. The result is that streams end up down cutting, and as the stream gets lower and lower, the water column drops with it, which then dries out the streamside areas, the riparian areas. The solution is to create the equivalent of beaver dams. I mentioned the phrase earlier, beaver dam analogs. Here's a shot of one of our teenagers on the newly created TU Expeditions program, which we're able to conduct thanks to support from the Bureau of Land Management, helping to build these so-called beaver dam analogs, which effectively lift the water column and extend the influence of the water out across the streamside area and the riparian area. It's good for wildlife. It's good for livestock. Importantly, it creates a natural fuel break from fires. And the TU Expeditions program, I could show you countless pictures like this where these kids went out and they not only built dozens and dozens of these process-based, low-tech restoration techniques, these beaver dam analogs, but they also fished. They learned a lot about conservation, and I'm fairly confident they had a good bit of fun along the way. The Driftless is such a cool place. It's the area of Wisconsin, Minnesota, Iowa, and Illinois that was effectively bypassed by the last glaciers. So the glaciers rolled through, but then they just went around this area. This is what you may remember as Black Earth country. It almost feels like Vermont, to me at least. The problem is that historic agricultural practices had caused creeks to look like this one that you see on the screen here. And as soon as I became the CEO of Trout Unlimited, I remember Duke Welter, one of our great grassroots leaders, coming to me and saying, hey, the chapters have been doing these isolated projects in this area. I think we can make this into something big. And if you know Duke, you will understand how much it pains me to say this, but boy, was Duke right. We hired Jeff Hastings and Sarah Strassman, and they have worked with partners to recover nearly 400 miles of driftless streams. And just so you have a sense of the scale of that work, pre-restoration on a typical driftless stream, we'll see anywhere from 100 to 200 fish per mile. A year or so after restoration, that can increase to 1,000 to 2,000 fish per mile. Multiply that by 400 miles, and you get a sense of the effect that we're having in the driftless area. Perhaps my favorite day of the year was participating in an event in Arizona not that long ago. It was actually at Bass Pro Shops. You can see some big bass in the photograph on the screen swimming behind me, where I was with Governor Hobbs. She's on my immediate right, and then Secretary Holland of the Secretary of Interior, and with others, and we were celebrating the delisting of the Apache trout. This is the first trout or salmon that has been taken off the Endangered Species Act in 50 years. 50 years. Champions in Arizona included our amazing volunteers. They are probably the most committed volunteers to native trout across the organization, and dedicated staff such as Nate Reese. And I remember when I started my career at the Bureau of Land Management, I learned about these desert trout populations, these Rio Grande cutthroat trout and Gila trout and Apache trout. And I remember talking to one of these old time, what we used to call combat biologists at the BLM. And I'll never forget what he said to me. He said, "Chris, forget about them. Those are write-off populations. They will never survive." Well, he was wrong. Not only are Apache trout not write-offs, they are the harbingers of hope for people who would otherwise feel powerless in the face of climate change. If we can recover native trout in anywhere, we can do it anywhere in the country. And next up are the Gila trout. So this is a photograph. This is my last slide. And so I'll let you all get back to your families. It's getting late here in the East, but this is a place called Beech Creek in Pennsylvania. I was there on Friday with G.T. Thompson, Congressman G.T. Thompson, who's the chair of the House Ag Committee. He was invited up there by our great leader in Pennsylvania, Amy Wolf, and her team to go on a tour, and we toured Beech Creek. The reason I wanted to show this is Beech Creek, as you can see, it flows right through all of those communities in that part of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. And these are all formerly resource-dependent communities. But the resources they were dependent on were coal, in this case, and wood. And they're not any longer. But because we're now in the process of recovering Beech Creek, I look forward to coming back in a few years and being able to tell you that they are still resource-dependent communities. But the resource that they're dependent on today is that river that you see in this image. So just in closing, I'd ask you to juxtapose what we have discussed tonight with what you read in the paper, what you watch on TV, and what you see in social media. And I would warrant it's a pretty stark contrast. We are a nation that is bound by a set of ideals that led to the formation of the United States of America. And I am honored to say that Trout Unlimited is the embodiment of those ideals. We work together to help our neighbors recover in rural Appalachia from devastating hurricanes. We are optimistic, and we believe in a future where Atlantic salmon once again swim up our main rivers and along the Atlantic coast. We are pragmatic, and we work together to fix the mistakes of the past in places such as the Upper Colorado. We do not allow politics to keep us from doing what is best for the nation, such as passing a fundamentally bipartisan law that will make it easier to clean up the scourge of abandoned hard rock mines. We never give up, even on species such as the Apache trout that are found in some of the most inhospitable parts of the country for trout. Now, today, you will hear America described in different ways by different political parties. I pity those of you who live in the 7 key swing states. But I'd ask that you forget what you hear and know this: we represent the best of America. The work of Trout Unlimited, your work, gives lie to the notion that America can no longer do big things. We do big things every day, and we do it without division or rancor. Every single day, we are working to build that shining city on a hill. Every day, let us continue to ask not what our country can do for us, but what we can do for our country. My mom used to tell me and my brothers that it's better to light one candle than to curse the darkness. And whatever happens in 9 days on election day, let us agree to continue to be that light in our communities and continue to serve as champions of our rivers and streams. Thanks everyone so much for being here, and I look forward to seeing many of you at our regional meetings or at our annual meeting next year in Minneapolis, St. Paul. Have a great evening.